The notification sound pinged softly in the darkness of our bedroom, and I instinctively reached for my phone, muscle memory guiding my fingers to the familiar glass surface on my maidstand. 3:47 a.m. The blue glow illuminated my face as I squinted at the screen, expecting another spam email or perhaps a late-night message from my sister on the West Coast. Instead, my heart nearly stopped. PayPal payment received, $12,847. I blinked hard, certain I was still dreaming. The numbers remained unchanged, stark and beautiful against the white background of my phone screen. $12,847 from a single affiliate commission in one night, while I slept. My hands trembled as I opened the PayPal app, scrolling through the recent transactions that had accumulated like digital snowflakes in a storm I couldn't have predicted. Commission after commission, payment after payment, each one representing hours of work I'd poured into my blog over the past 18 months. Work that my husband David had repeatedly dismissed as a cute little hobby whenever his colleagues asked about it at dinner parties. The irony tasted bitter on my tongue as I lay there in the pre-dawn silence, listening to his steady breathing beside me. David, the successful marketing executive who earned a respectable six-figure salary and never let me forget it. David, who had suggested just last week that maybe it was time I considered getting a real job now that the kids were older. David, who had no idea that his wife's silly hobby had just generated more revenue in a single month than his corporate position earned in 3. I slipped quietly from our bed, my bare feet finding the familiar path through our suburban home to my small office, tucked away in what used to be a storage room. The space was cramped, furnished with a secondhand desk I'd bought on Craigslist, and a chair that squeaked whenever I leaned back too far. But it was mine. Every sticky note on the wall, every coffee ring stained into the wooden surface, every cord snaking behind my laptop represented something David couldn't understand. The intoxicating rush of building something from nothing. The blog had started innocently enough. Mindful Mama Musings, I'd called it, cringing even as I typed the domain name into the registration form. I was 34, drowning in the monotony of suburban motherhood, desperate for an outlet that didn't involve discussing carpool schedules or comparing organic lunch options with the other moms at school pickup. Writing had always been my secret love, the thing I'd abandoned when pregnancy and marriage and mortgage payments became more pressing than pursuing dreams that didn't pay the bills. Those first posts were raw, unpolished confessions typed into the void at midnight when the house was finally quiet. I wrote about the crushing weight of perfectionism that followed me through grocery store aisles, the way I'd stand in Target holding a decorative throw pillow, wondering if this purchase would finally transform me into the woman I saw in home decor magazines. I wrote about the peculiar loneliness of being surrounded by family, yet feeling completely invisible. About the dreams I'd tucked away in boxes like seasonal decorations, brought out only when no one was looking. Within 6 months, my daily readership had grown from my mom and my sister to several thousand strangers who felt like friends. The numbers on my analytics dashboard became an addiction. I'd refresh the page obsessively, watching the visitor count climb, feeling a rush of validation every time someone shared one of my posts on social media. David would find me at my laptop at odd hours, typing furiously with the intensity of a woman possessed. "Still playing with your blog?" he'd ask, the word playing dripping with the kind of condescension usually reserved for children arranging tea parties. He'd peer over my shoulder at the screen, scanning the comments section where hundreds of women poured out their hearts to a stranger they'd never met. "It's sweet that you have this little outlet," he'd continue, already reaching for his phone to check his work emails. "Just don't let it take up too much time. The house has been looking a bit neglected lately." The monetization happened gradually, almost by accident. A company reached out asking if I review their meal planning service. They offered $50 for an honest post. And I laughed out loud at the absurdity. Someone wanted to pay me to write about something I was already doing anyway. I accepted, crafted a genuine review about how their service had simplified my weekly chaos, and published it with the awkward disclaimer that I'd received compensation for my opinion. The response was overwhelmingly positive. My readers appreciated the transparency, and more importantly, many of them signed up for the service using my affiliate link. Within a week, I'd earned an additional $300 in commissions. David noticed the extra money in our account and raised an eyebrow when I explained where it came from. "Well, that's unexpected," he said, but I could see the calculations running behind his eyes. He was the numbers person in our relationship, the one who tracked every expense and questioned every purchase. The idea that my hobby could generate actual revenue seemed to shift something in his perception, though he was careful not to show too much enthusiasm. More opportunities followed. Brands began reaching out directly, offering increasingly generous compensation for sponsored content. I learned to navigate the delicate balance between authentic recommendation and commercial promotion, always putting my readers' trust first. My audience continued to grow, drawn not just by the relatability of my content, but by the genuine community we were building together. The real breakthrough came when I launched my first digital product, an organizational system I'd developed for managing the chaos of family life. I'd mentioned it casually in a blog post, describing the color-coded calendar and meal planning templates that had saved my sanity during a particularly overwhelming month. The response was immediate and intense. Hundreds of readers begged me to share the system, offering to pay whatever I thought was fair. I spent 2 weeks creating a comprehensive guide complete with printable templates and video tutorials. I priced it at $27, a number that felt simultaneously too high and too low. David laughed when I showed him the sales page, professional looking despite being cobbled together with free design tools and sheer determination. $27 for organization tips? He said, shaking his head. "I mean, good for you, honey, but I'm not sure how many people will actually pay for something they could probably figure out themselves." I launched the product on a Thursday morning, my heart hammering as I hit the publish button on the blog post that would announce its availability. Within an hour, I had sold 50 copies. By evening, the number had climbed to over 200. I sat in my tiny office, staring at the sales dashboard with tears streaming down my face. In one day, I'd earned more than $5,000 selling something I'd created from scratch, something that came directly from my own experience and expertise. David found me there an hour later, still crying over my laptop screen. "What's wrong?" he asked, immediately concerned that something terrible had happened. "Nothing's wrong," I managed between sobs. "Everything's right. Everything's finally right." When I showed him the numbers, his expression cycled through disbelief, surprise, and something that looked almost like pride. Almost. But by morning, he'd returned to his familiar dismissiveness, suggesting that the success was probably a fluke, that I shouldn't get my hopes up about sustaining that kind of income from blog stuff. That was 8 months ago. Since then, I've launched 3 more digital products, each one more successful than the last. I'd secured ongoing partnerships with brands that aligned perfectly with my values and my audience's needs. I'd started a membership community that brought in steady monthly revenue, and I'd begun speaking at conferences about authentic content creation and building trust with online audiences. The money had snowballed in ways I couldn't have imagined. What started as $50 brand partnerships had evolved into 5-figure sponsorship deals. My affiliate commissions alone now exceeded what I used to earn in my previous corporate job. And yet, to David, it remained a hobby, something I did to keep busy while he handled the real work of supporting our family. Now, sitting in my office at 4 a.m, looking at a single commission payment that dwarfed his monthly salary, I felt the weight of 18 months of condescension settling on my shoulders. Every dismissive comment, every suggestion that I was neglecting my real responsibilities, every time he'd introduce me at social events as just a stay-at-home mom who writes a little blog. The truth was more complex than the numbers on my screen could convey. Yes, I was earning more money than I'd ever dreamed possible. But more importantly, I'd found my voice again. I'd built something meaningful, something that mattered to thousands of women who felt seen and heard through my words. I'd created a business from nothing but authentic connection and hard work, proving to myself that the dreams I'd packed away weren't as impossible as I'd been led to believe. I opened my laptop and began typing, my fingers moving with the fluid confidence that came from months of practice. Tomorrow, David would wake up and ask about the blog stuff with his usual patronizing smile. And tomorrow, I would finally tell him exactly how much his wife's silly hobby was worth. But first, I had work to do. Real work. The kind that mattered. The morning came too quickly, sunlight streaming through our bedroom windows with an intensity that felt almost accusatory. I'd managed maybe 2 hours of sleep after discovering that commission, my mind spinning with scenarios of how I would finally tell David the truth. But as I lay there listening to his alarm buzzer through its familiar cycle, watching him stretch and yawn with the casual confidence of a man who'd never questioned his place in the world, the weight of 18 months of secrecy pressed down on my chest like a physical force. "Morning, babe," he mumbled, already reaching for his phone to check his work emails before his feet touched the floor. This was David's routine, as predictable as sunrise. Phone first, shower second, coffee third, kiss goodbye fourth. I used to find his consistency comforting. Now it felt like evidence of how little attention he actually paid to the details of our shared life. I wanted to tell him right then. I wanted to roll over and say, "David, we need to talk about my blog." But the words stuck in my throat like dry toast. Instead, I mumbled something about getting the kids ready for school and escaped to the kitchen where I could hide behind the familiar choreography of morning chaos. Emma, our 12-year-old, was already at the table, her dark hair falling across her face as she hunched over her phone, thumbs moving with the supernatural speed that seemed to be genetically encoded in her generation. Jake, our 9-year-old, burst into the kitchen like a tornado, his backpack trailing papers and the eternal mystery of why children could never seem to keep their belongings inside their bags. "Mom, I need $20 for the field trip today," Jake announced, as if this was information he'd shared with me previously rather than a bomb he was dropping at 7:15 a.m. "What field trip?" I asked, already mentally calculating whether I had cash in my wallet, already feeling the familiar spike of anxiety that came with unexpected expenses, even though I now had more money in my business account than we had in our savings for the past 5 years combined. "The Science Museum thing. I gave you the paper last week." Jake's tone suggested that my failure to remember this crucial information was a personal failing of epic proportions. Emma looked up from her phone long enough to roll her eyes. "He didn't give you any paper, Mom. He probably left it in his locker like he always does." "Did not! Did too. Kids." My voice carried the particular brand of exhaustion that every parent recognizes, the kind that goes deeper than lack of sleep and touches something fundamental about the relentless nature of keeping small humans alive and functional. "Emma, help your brother find the permission slip information in his school portal. Jake, go brush your teeth. We'll figure out the money." David appeared in the kitchen doorway, immaculate in his navy suit and perfectly knotted tie. He looked like the kind of man who had never lost a permission slip or forgotten a field trip, though in reality, he'd never been responsible for remembering those details in the first place. That was my job, along with grocery shopping, meal planning, coordinating doctor appointments, managing social calendars, and somehow keeping track of the infinite moving pieces that comprised our family life. "What's this about $20? He asked, pouring coffee into his travel mug with the efficiency of someone who had mastered the art of appearing helpful while avoiding actual responsibility. "Field trip," I said simply, not trusting myself to say more without the resentment creeping into my voice. didn't we just pay for something like this last month? He frowned, as if our children's educational opportunities were an unexpected drain on resources we couldn't afford. These schools really nickel and dime parents to death. I wanted to laugh or scream or both. $20. He was concerned about $20 while I'd earned nearly $13,000 in my sleep. But I couldn't say that, couldn't reveal that I had money he didn't know about, couldn't admit that I'd been living a double life where his wife, the silly blogger, was actually a successful entrepreneur. The secret started small, almost innocent. In the early days of monetization, when I was earning $50 here and there, it felt easier to keep the money separate. David was so particular about our finances, wanting to know where every penny went, questioning purchases that didn't fit his predetermined categories of necessity. The blog income felt different, precious in a way that I wasn't ready to share. It was mine in a way that nothing else in my adult life had ever been truly mine. As the income grew, the secret grew with it. I opened a separate business account, carefully categorizing every deposit and expense, maintaining meticulous records that David would never see. I told myself I was being responsible, building something for our future, creating a safety net that could protect our family if anything ever happened to his job. But deep down, I knew the real reason I kept the money hidden was more complicated than financial planning. The money represented proof that I was capable of more than David believed. But this revelation would change everything between us. If you're enjoying this story of hidden success and marital transformation, please take just 30 seconds to hit that like button and subscribe for more incredible true stories. It really helps us continue sharing these powerful narratives with you. Proof that my ideas had value beyond the domestic sphere he'd relegated me to. Proof that the woman I'd been before marriage and motherhood wasn't dead, just dormant, waiting for the right opportunity to emerge and prove her worth to a world that had forgotten she existed. But secrets have weight, and after 18 months, mine had grown heavy enough to affect my posture. I found myself hunching my shoulders, avoiding eye contact when David asked about my day, deflecting conversations about money and future plans. The success that should have filled me with confidence instead made me feel like a fraud in my own home. "I'll handle the field trip money," I said, grabbing my purse and pulling out a $20 bill from a wallet that contained credit cards connected to accounts David had never seen. "Jake, teeth, now." Our son thundered out of the kitchen, leaving a trail of cereal crumbs in his wake. David checked his watch, a gesture that always preceded his departure for the adult world of important meetings and serious conversations. "Johnson wants to go over the quarterly numbers after the client meeting."
"Okay," I replied, the word automatic and meaningless. How many times had I said okay to last-minute schedule changes, to meals eaten alone, to evenings spent managing homework and bedtime routines, while he built relationships and advanced his career? How many times had I absorbed the inconvenience of his success while my own achievements remained invisible? After he left, after the kids were finally out the door with their backpacks and lunchboxes and the eternal optimism of children who believed their parents had everything under control, I sat in my kitchen and felt the familiar wave of loneliness that had become my morning companion. The house was quiet, except for the hum of appliances and the distant sound of neighbors starting their own days, and I was alone with the weight of everything I couldn't say. My phone buzzed with notifications from my blog's social media accounts, comments on yesterday's post, shares from readers who found meaning in my words, messages from women who felt less alone because of something I'd written. The irony wasn't lost on me that I was helping thousands of strangers feel more connected while I felt increasingly isolated in my own home. I walked to my small office and opened my laptop, immediately immersed in a world where my thoughts mattered, where my expertise was valued, where I was Sarah the successful blogger and entrepreneur rather than Sarah the wife and mother whose contributions were measured in clean laundry and home-cooked meals. The analytics dashboard showed overnight growth in every metric that mattered. Email subscribers, social media followers, website traffic, revenue, all trending upward with the steady persistence of something built on genuine value rather than luck or timing. An email from my literary agent sat at the top of my inbox, the subject line making my heart skip. Book deal update, publisher interest. I'd been quietly working on a book proposal for months, expanding on the themes that resonated most with my blog readers. The idea of seeing my name on a book cover, of walking into a bookstore and finding my work on the shelves, felt like a dream I wasn't allowed to want. The email contained news that would have sent me running through the house screaming with joy if I'd been allowed to share it with the person who supposedly knew me best. 3 publishers were interested. The advance numbers being discussed were substantial enough to change our family's financial future. But as I sat there, reading about this incredible opportunity, all I could think about was how I would have to celebrate alone, how I would have to pretend this life-changing moment wasn't happening because I dug myself too deep into a hole of secrecy to climb out gracefully. My phone rang, startling me out of my spiral of self-pity. The caller ID showed my sister's name, and I answered with the desperate gratitude of a woman who needed to talk to someone who understood the complexities of being a woman in a world that constantly questioned your value. "Meredith," I said, not bothering to hide the emotion in my voice. "Sarah, what's wrong? You sound like you've been crying." "I haven't been crying," I lied, wiping my eyes with the back of my hand. I'm having a morning." Meredith lived in Portland with her partner Lisa, running a successful catering business and living the kind of life that looked exactly like what she had chosen, rather than what had happened to her by default. She was 3 years younger than me, but infinitely wiser at the art of not apologizing for taking up space in the world. "Talk to me," she said, and I could picture her settling into her favorite chair with a cup of coffee, giving me the kind of undivided attention that David hadn't offered in years. So I told her. Not everything, but enough. I told her about the money, about the success, about the crushing weight of keeping it secret from the person who should have been my biggest supporter. I told her about the book deal possibility and how I couldn't share the news with my own husband. I told her about feeling like a stranger in my own life, successful and invisible at the same time. "Sarah," she said, when I finally ran out of words, "you realize this is insane, right? You're hiding the fact that you're successful. Do you hear how backward that is?" "It's complicated," I started, but she cut me off.
No, it's not. It's actually very simple. You're successful, and instead of celebrating that success, you're apologizing for it. Instead of demanding recognition for what you've built, you're hiding it like it's something to be ashamed of.
But David...
But David, nothing. David married a brilliant, capable woman. And instead of celebrating when that woman proves exactly how brilliant and capable she is, he dismisses her achievements as a hobby. That says something about David, not about you. The truth of her words hit me like cold water. I'd been so focused on protecting David's ego, on maintaining the familiar dynamic of our relationship, that I'd lost sight of how fundamentally wrong it was for me to hide my success to make someone else comfortable with their assumptions about my limitations.
I don't know how to tell him,
I admitted. It's been so long, and the numbers are so big now. He's going to be angry that I kept it from him, and he's going to be threatened by the money, and everything is going to change. Everything needs to change, Meredith said firmly. You can't build a marriage on one person being small so the other person can feel big. That's not partnership, that's performance. After we hung up, I sat in my office surrounded by the evidence of my success. The awards I'd won for my blog, the screenshots of sales numbers I'd printed and tucked into a drawer, the thank you cards from readers whose lives had been touched by my work. All of it hidden away like contraband, like proof of crimes I'd committed rather than achievements I'd earned. The afternoon brought its usual chaos of school pickup and homework supervision, of snacks and sibling arguments, and the 100 small decisions that comprised the invisible labor of motherhood. But underneath the familiar routine, something was shifting. Meredith's words had planted a seed of rebellion that was already taking root. When David came home after 9, looking tired but satisfied with whatever victories he'd achieved in his important meetings, I was waiting for him in the living room with my laptop open and a folder full of printed documents on the coffee table.
What's all this?
He asked, loosening his tie and glancing at the papers with the casual interest of someone who expected to find household bills or school forms. "We need to talk," I said, my voice steadier than I felt. "About my blog, about our marriage, about the fact that I've been living a double life for the past 18 months.
His expression shifted from tired confusion to sharp attention. What do you mean, double life? I took a deep breath and opened my laptop screen, turning it toward him so he could see the dashboard that showed my blog's analytics, my social media reach, my email list that now numbered in the hundreds of thousands. "I mean," I said, "that while you've been calling my work a silly hobby, I've been building a business that's earning more money than we've ever seen. I mean that 3 publishers want to offer me a book deal. I mean that your wife isn't the woman you think she is. And it's time you met the real me." The silence that followed was deafening, filled with the weight of 18 months of secrets and the sound of our marriage shifting on its foundations. David stared at the laptop screen for what felt like an eternity, his eyes moving across the numbers with the methodical precision he usually reserved for quarterly reports and budget analyses. I watched his face cycle through emotions like a time-lapse video of weather patterns, confusion giving way to disbelief, disbelief morphing into something that looked almost like betrayal, and finally settling into an expression I'd never seen before. It was the look of a man whose fundamental understanding of the world had just shifted beneath his feet. "These numbers," he said slowly, his voice barely above a whisper. "Sarah, these numbers can't be real." "They're real," I replied, surprised by how calm my voice sounded when everything inside me felt like it was vibrating at the frequency of an earthquake. "Every single one of them?" He leaned forward, squinting at the screen as if proximity might reveal the numbers to be some elaborate hoax. This says you made $87,000 last month alone?"
$93,000, I corrected quietly. The dashboard updates in real time. I had some late commissions come in yesterday. The corrections seemed to physically stagger him. He sat back against the couch cushions like I'd pushed him, his hands running through his hair in the gesture I recognized as his response to overwhelming stress. It was the same movement he'd made when the company restructured his department, when his father had his heart attack, when we'd gotten the estimate for Emma's orthodontic work that we couldn't afford. $93,000? He repeated, as if saying it out loud might help his brain process what his eyes were seeing. In 1 month? From blogging? From my business, I said, emphasis on the word he'd never used to describe my work. From the platform I've been building while you've been dismissing it as a hobby. That word, dismissing, seemed to snap something into focus for him. His expression shifted from shock to something harder, more defensive. Dismissing? I never dismissed you, Sarah. I've always been supportive of your writing. Supportive? The laugh that escaped me was sharp enough to cut glass. David, you literally told the Johnsons at their anniversary party that I play around on the internet while you do the real work of supporting our family. You've suggested multiple times that maybe it was time I got a real job. You called my work a cute outlet. How exactly is that supportive? I never meant... He struggled for words, his carefully constructed worldview clearly failing to provide him with a script for this conversation. I didn't know it was making this kind of money. Because you never asked. In 18 months, you never once asked me about my revenue, my audience growth, my business plan, my goals. You never showed any interest in understanding what I was actually doing. You never told me. The words exploded out of him with the force of genuine frustration. We're married, Sarah. We're supposed to be partners. Partners don't keep secrets like this. And there it was.
the word that had been lurking beneath every interaction we'd had about my blog for the past year and a half: secrets. The accusation hung in the air between us like smoke from a house fire, acrid and impossible to ignore. "You're right," I said, setting down my laptop and looking at him directly for the first time since this conversation began. "Partners don't keep secrets. Partners also don't dismiss each other's dreams. Partners don't make unilateral decisions about what constitutes real work. Partners don't create an environment where success has to be hidden because it threatens the established order. That's not what I did." But his voice lacked conviction, and I could see the wheels turning in his head as he replayed months of conversations through this new lens. "David, do you remember what you said when I told you I wanted to start a blog?" He was quiet for a long moment, and I could see him searching his memory. I said it sounded like a nice way for you to express yourself." "You said it sounded like a nice way for you to get your feelings out so you could focus on more important things. You suggested I set a timer so it wouldn't interfere with household responsibilities. You literally patted my head like I was a child showing you a crayon drawing." The memory seemed to hit him like a physical blow. I watched the color drain from his face as he recalled the conversation that had planted the first seed of resentment in my chest. I didn't mean it like that." "But that's how you said it. And that's been your attitude ever since. Every time you've introduced me at social events, every time colleagues have asked what I do, every time the subject of my work has come up, you've minimized it. You've made it clear that my value in this marriage comes from being your wife and the kid's mother, and anything beyond that is just extra, cute, a hobby." David stood up abruptly, pacing to the window and back like a caged animal. "Okay, maybe I didn't take it seriously at first, but Sarah, you have to understand. People start blogs all the time. 99% of them never make any real money. I was trying to protect you from disappointment." "Protect me? Or protect yourself from the possibility that your wife might be successful at something that didn't require your approval or involvement?"
The question hung in the air like a challenge, and I could see it hit its mark. David's jaw tightened, his hands clenching into fists at his sides, not in threat, but in the kind of frustration that comes when someone voices the thing you'd been trying not to think about. "That's not fair," he said, but his voice was quieter now, less certain. "Isn't it, David? In the 3 years since I've been working on this blog, how many times have you asked to read one of my posts? How many times have you shared my content on your own social media? How many times have you mentioned my work to your colleagues without using it as a punchline about how wives need their little creative outlets?" Each question was a precision strike, and I could see them landing. David had always prided himself on being a supportive husband, a progressive man who believed in equality and women's empowerment. But support, I was learning, was easy to claim and much harder to practice when it required examining your own assumptions about power and value. I shared that post you wrote about Emma's school project. Once. You shared one post, one time, in 18 months. And you shared it because it reflected well on Emma, not because it showcased my writing or insights. He opened his mouth to argue, then closed it again. The defense he'd been building was crumbling under the weight of accumulated evidence, and we both knew it. "Sarah, I'm sorry if I didn't support you the way you needed, but keeping this from me, this money, this success, that wasn't the answer. We could have figured this out together." "Could we?" I picked up the folder of printed documents from the coffee table, fanning through pages of profit and loss statements, tax documents, business registrations. "Because I tried to include you, David. I tried to share my excitement when I got my first brand partnership. I tried to explain affiliate marketing when the commission started growing. I tried to show you the analytics when my audience reached 50,000 subscribers. And every single time, you changed the subject or made a joke or found a way to redirect the conversation to something you considered more important." "That's not... I don't remember it that way." "Of course you don't, because to you, those weren't important moments worth remembering. They were just your wife babbling about her little internet project." I could see the truth of my words settling into his consciousness like sediment in still water. The accumulated weight of dismissal, of casual condescension, of assumptions about whose work mattered and whose was merely decoration.
It was painful to watch someone you love realize they'd been inflicting damage without meaning to, but it was also necessary. "The money," he said suddenly, as if just remembering that detail. "Where is it? What have you been doing with it?" I pulled out my phone and opened the banking app for my business account, turning the screen toward him. The balance displayed there was larger than our combined retirement savings, larger than the equity we had in our house, larger than any number either of us had ever been personally responsible for. Most of it is in the business account, earning interest while I decide what to do with it long term. Some of it I've been reinvesting in the business, better equipment, professional photography, course development. I've been paying estimated taxes quarterly through my accountant. "Your accountant?" His voice cracked on the words. "Sarah, you have an accountant?" "I have a whole team. An accountant, a lawyer for contract negotiations, a virtual assistant who helps manage my social media, a graphic designer for my course materials. I have a business, David, a real, legitimate, profitable business."
Each revelation seemed to widen the chasm between the woman he thought he'd married and the woman sitting across from him. I could practically see him recalculating everything he thought he knew about our relationship, our finances, our future. "Why?" he asked finally, and there was something raw and vulnerable in his voice that made my chest tighten. "Why didn't you tell me? Why did you let me think you were just... Why did you let me go on believing that I was the only one bringing in real money?" The question cut to the heart of everything. And for the first time since this conversation began, I felt tears threatening. Because the answer was complicated and painful and indicted both of us in different ways. "Because I liked it," I said quietly. "Because for the first time in my adult life, I had something that was completely mine, something I'd built with my own hands, my own mind, my own effort. Something that existed independent of being your wife or their mother, and I wasn't ready to share it with someone who I wasn't sure would value it the way I did." "But I would have..." "Would you?" I interrupted. "Really? If I'd come to you 18 months ago and said I wanted to invest in professional photography equipment and hire a virtual assistant for my blog, would you have supported that decision? If I'd told you I was thinking about incorporating my business and hiring an accountant, would you have encouraged me, or would you have suggested I was getting ahead of myself?" The silence that followed was answer enough. We both knew that the David of 18 months ago would have seen those expenses as frivolous, would have questioned whether I was being financially responsible, would have suggested we use the money for more practical purposes like home improvements or the kids' college funds. "I would have learned," he said finally. "I would have grown with you." "Maybe. But David, you had 18 months to learn. You had 18 months to ask questions, to show curiosity, to treat my work like it might actually be work. Instead, you doubled down on seeing it as a hobby. Just last week, you suggested I might want to consider getting a real job. Last week, while I was earning more than you make in 3 months. The comparison was brutal but necessary. David's salary had always been the measuring stick by which all our financial decisions were made. His income determined our lifestyle, our vacation plans, our retirement projections. The idea that his wife was quietly out-earning him by a factor of 3 must have felt like discovering that gravity worked in reverse. I don't understand how this happened," he said, slumping back onto the couch like the conversation had physically exhausted him. "How did you go from writing blog posts to making this kind of money? This doesn't make sense." So I explained it to him. I walked him through the evolution of my business step by step, from those first raw posts about motherhood and identity to the development of digital products that solved real problems for real people. I showed him the emails from readers whose lives had been changed by my organizational systems, my courses on rediscovering personal identity after motherhood, my membership community where thousands of women supported each other through major life transitions. I explained affiliate marketing and how authentic recommendations to my audience generated commissions. I showed him the media kit I used for brand partnerships, the rate card that commanded 5-figure fees for sponsored content because my engagement rates and audience demographics were exactly what companies wanted to reach. I walked him through the book deal negotiations, the speaking opportunities, the podcast appearances, the entire ecosystem of expertise and authority I'd built around topics I'd lived and breathed and struggled with myself. It's not just about the money, I said as I closed the laptop and gathered the papers back into their folder. Although the money is life-changing, it's about building something meaningful. It's about using my experiences, our experiences as a family, to help other people navigate their own challenges. It's about discovering that I have valuable insights and skills that extend beyond keeping our household running.
David was quiet for a long time, processing everything I'd shared. When he finally spoke, his voice was small and uncertain in a way I'd never heard before. I feel like I don't know you anymore. The admission hung between us like a bridge neither of us was sure we wanted to cross. Because the truth was, he was right. The woman who'd built this business, who'd found her voice and her confidence and her financial independence, wasn't the same woman he'd married. She was someone I'd been before marriage and motherhood changed the shape of my ambitions, and she was also someone entirely new, forged by the experience of proving to herself what she was capable of. "Maybe you never really knew me," I said gently. "Maybe we both got so comfortable with the roles we'd fallen into that we stopped seeing each other clearly." The roles we'd fallen into? There was a sharp edge to his voice now, the first hint of real anger I'd heard since this conversation began. What's that supposed to mean? "It means you've been comfortable being the successful one, the breadwinner, the one whose work matters and gets respected and talked about at dinner parties. And I've been comfortable being the supportive wife, the one who makes your success possible by handling everything else so you can focus on your career. There's nothing wrong with that arrangement. It's worked for us." Has it really worked, David? Or has it just been easy? Because there's a difference between something working and something being convenient. He stood up again, the agitation clear in his posture. "So what are you saying? That our entire marriage has been a lie? That everything we've built together doesn't matter because I didn't realize you were secretly running some internet empire?" "I'm saying our marriage has been based on assumptions that aren't true anymore. Maybe they were never true, but they're definitely not true now. I'm not the same person I was when we got married, and I don't think you are either. The question is whether we can figure out how to love the people we've become instead of clinging to the people we used to be." The words came out more philosophical than I'd intended, but they felt true in a way that surprised me. Because that's what this was really about. Not just the money or the business or even the secrecy, but the fundamental question of whether two people could evolve within a marriage without growing apart. "I don't know what you want from me," David said, and for the first time he sounded lost rather than defensive. "Do I want you to apologize for not being psychic? For not realizing you were building something this big? For not understanding that my wife was becoming some kind of internet entrepreneur influencer person while I thought she was just writing about mom stuff? I want you to understand why I felt like I couldn't tell you. I want you to recognize that the way you've talked about my work for the past 18 months made it clear that you didn't value it. I want you to acknowledge that your support has been conditional on my success being small enough to not threaten your position as the primary breadwinner in our family. That's not fair, Sarah. Isn't it? When was the last time you introduced me as an entrepreneur? When was the last time you mentioned my business in a conversation with your colleagues without making it sound like a cute hobby? When was the last time you treated my work schedule as important as your own?" Each question was a scalpel, precise and surgical, and I could see them cutting away at his defenses. But I also saw something else, genuine pain. The kind that comes from recognizing your own failures in the mirror someone holds up to your behavior. "I never meant to make you feel unsupported," he said quietly. "But you did. And now I've built something incredible, and instead of being able to celebrate it together, we're sitting here fighting about why I kept it secret. Do you see how backward that is? The conversation could have gone on for hours. There was 18 months of resentment to unpack, assumptions to examine, patterns to dissect. But somewhere in the midst of all that excavation, something shifted. Maybe it was exhaustion, or maybe it was the recognition that we were both right and both wrong in different ways, but the anger began to ebb into something more manageable.
"What happens now?" David asked eventually. It was the first question he'd asked that sounded like he was genuinely curious about the answer, rather than trying to win an argument. And for the first time in hours, I realized I wasn't entirely sure what the answer was. The question hung in the air like morning mist, heavy with possibility and uncertainty. What happens now? I looked at my husband, really looked at him, perhaps for the first time in months. His usually perfect hair was disheveled from running his hands through it, his tie hung loose around his neck, and his eyes held a vulnerability I hadn't seen since the early days of our relationship, when everything between us was still uncharted territory. "I don't know," I answered honestly. "I've been so focused on building something and hiding it and protecting it that I never really thought about what would happen when the truth finally came out." Before I continue with how David reacted to seeing my actual blog, if this story is resonating with you, please share it with someone who needs to hear about the power of believing in yourself. Your share could change someone's life, and it takes less than 10 seconds. David nodded slowly, as if my uncertainty was somehow reassuring. Can I see it? The blog? I mean, really see it, not just the numbers. The request surprised me. In 18 months, he'd never asked to read my actual content, never shown curiosity about what I was writing that resonated so deeply with so many people. I opened my laptop again, navigating to the blog's homepage with fingers that trembled slightly. This is Mindful Mama Musings, though I've been thinking about rebranding to something more professional as the business grows. The site looked different from his perspective than it did from mine. Where I saw familiar layouts and color schemes I'd tweaked dozens of times, he saw something polished and professional, a far cry from the amateur hobby blog he'd imagined. The header featured a professional photo of me that he'd never seen, not the harried mother in yoga pants he was used to, but a confident woman with styled hair and genuine warmth in her eyes. "You look," he started, then stopped, studying the image. "You look different. Confident." That's because I am different. This work, this community I've built, it's changed me. It's reminded me of who I was before I became so focused on being what everyone else needed me to be. He scrolled through recent posts, reading headlines that revealed the scoop of what I had been creating. Rediscovering your identity after motherhood, a step-by-step guide, how to build multiple income streams while managing family life, the hidden cost of people-pleasing, and how to break the cycle. These are really good," he said, and I could hear genuine surprise in his voice. "Sarah, these are actually really good. This one about people-pleasing." He clicked on the link, and I watched his face as he read words I'd written at 2 a.m. after a particularly frustrating conversation about my tendency to say yes to everything except my own needs. "The comments," he said after several minutes of reading. "There are hundreds of comments on every post. These women they're really talking to you about serious things." I leaned over to point at specific comment threads. That woman, Jennifer from Ohio, she's been reading for over a year. She started her own business after reading my post about overcoming fear of failure. She sends me updates every few months. And Maria from Texas, she left an abusive relationship after reading my series on recognizing your own worth. She credits the blog community with giving her the courage to change her life. David continued scrolling, and I watched his understanding shift with each post he read, each comment thread he explored. This wasn't just a blog where I shared random thoughts about motherhood. This was a platform where I'd built something approaching a movement, a space where women found permission to want more from their lives and practical advice for how to get it. "This post about financial independence," he said, clicking on a piece I'd written 6 months earlier about why women needed their own money. "You wrote this while you were..."
while you were actually becoming financially independent. I wrote it because I was living it. Every post comes from something I've experienced or struggled with or figured out. That's why it resonates. I'm not writing from some theoretical place. I'm writing from the trenches of actually trying to build a life that feels authentic. He spent almost an hour going through my content, occasionally reading passages aloud as if he needed to hear the words in his own voice to believe I'd written them. When he finally closed the laptop, his expression was complicated. Part admiration, part confusion, part something that looked like grief. He said, "I feel like an idiot."
David, no, I do. I've been living with this brilliant, insightful woman who's been helping thousands of people transform their lives, and I've been treating her like her thoughts weren't worth taking seriously. I've been married to someone who built this incredible business, this community, this empire, and I've been patting her on the head and telling her it's cute that she has a hobby. The pain in his voice was raw and immediate, and I felt my anger softening despite myself. Because for all his dismissiveness, for all the ways he'd made me feel small and unimportant, I could see now that he genuinely hadn't understood what he was dismissing. The David I'd fallen in love with wasn't cruel or deliberately undermining. He was just limited by his own assumptions about what success looked like and where it could come from. "You couldn't have known," I said, though the words felt inadequate. "I didn't give you much of a chance to know." "But I should have been curious. I should have asked questions. I should have—" He shook his head, frustration clear in his posture. "Sarah, I've spent my entire career learning to recognize potential, to spot opportunities before they become obvious. How did I miss this? How did I miss that my own wife was building something this significant?" It was a fair question, and the answer revealed something uncomfortable about both of us. "Because you weren't looking for it in me. You were comfortable with me being the supporting character in your success story. And I was comfortable letting you see me that way because it felt safer than risking your judgment of my ambitions." Safer? I chose my words carefully, knowing this was delicate territory. "David, you've always been the successful one in our relationship. Your career, your salary, your professional achievements, that's been your identity, and it's been a source of pride for both of us. If I'd told you from the beginning that I was trying to build something potentially bigger than what you'd achieved, how would you have reacted? I would have supported you. Would you? Really? Or would you have found subtle ways to manage my expectations, to remind me how difficult it is to succeed in business, to suggest that maybe I should start smaller or be more realistic about my goals?" The silence that followed was telling, because we both knew that the David of 18 months ago, faced with his wife's ambitious business plans, would likely have responded with the kind of cautious pragmatism that sounds supportive but feels dismissive. "I don't know," he admitted finally. "I want to say I would have been nothing but encouraging, but I don't know. And that says something about me that I don't like very much." This was the David I remembered falling in love with, the one who could examine his own blind spots without defensiveness, who could sit with uncomfortable truths about himself and use them as opportunities for growth, rather than reasons for justification. "There's something else," I said, pulling out my phone to show him the email from my literary agent, about the book deal. He read the email twice, his eyebrows climbing higher with each paragraph. The advance figures being discussed were substantial enough to pay off our mortgage with money left over for the kids' college funds. The publisher was one of the major houses, the kind whose books appeared in airport bookstores and topped bestseller lists. "A book deal," he said wonderingly. "You're going to be a published author." "I'm going to be a published author who's married to a man who called her work a silly hobby," I said, and I could hear the hurt creeping back into my voice, despite my efforts to stay neutral. "David, how am I supposed to go to book signings and speaking events and introduce my husband when he spent the past year and a half undermining my credibility?"
The question hit him like a physical blow. I could see him imagining the scenario. Cocktail parties with other authors and industry professionals, conversations where my success would be the focus and his achievements would be background information. Social situations where he would be introduced as Sarah's husband rather than the other way around. "You're embarrassed by me," he said, and there was a note of realization in his voice that sounded almost like relief, as if he'd finally identified the source of a vague discomfort he'd been feeling. "I'm embarrassed by the way you talk about my work," I corrected. "I'm embarrassed by the possibility that people in my professional world might meet you and see someone who doesn't respect what I've built. But David, you're not my employee or my accessory. You don't have to be proud of my success for it to be valid. You just have to stop actively undermining it." "I never meant to undermine you." "But you did. Impact matters more than intention. And the impact of 18 months of dismissive comments and suggestions that I get a real job has been that I felt like I had to hide my success from the person who should have been celebrating it with me." We talked until past midnight, excavating the layers of assumption and resentment and misunderstanding that had accumulated between us. David asked questions about my business that he should have asked months earlier, about my target audience, my revenue streams, my long-term goals. I answered them, but part of me wondered if his sudden curiosity was genuine or simply a response to learning about the money involved. "I want to understand," he said eventually. "I want to learn about what you've built and figure out how to support it going forward. But Sarah, I need you to help me understand how we move forward with this kind of secret between us. How do we rebuild trust when you've been living a completely separate financial life?" It was a fair question and one I'd been dreading, because the money wasn't just numbers on a screen. It represented power and independence and choices I could make without his input or approval. It represented the ability to leave if I needed to support myself and contribute to supporting our children, to make decisions based on what I wanted rather than what we could afford on his salary alone. "I've been thinking about that," I said carefully, "and I think maybe we need to restructure how we handle finances in general. Not just the blog money, but everything." "What do you mean?" I took a deep breath, knowing this conversation was about to get even more complicated. "I mean, maybe it's time we each had more financial autonomy. You have your career and your salary, and I have my business and my income. We contribute to shared expenses proportionally, we make joint decisions about major purchases, but we each maintain our own financial independence." "You want separate bank accounts?" "I want us to be partners by choice rather than by economic necessity. I want to know that we're together because we love each other and enjoy building a life together, not because neither of us could afford to maintain our lifestyle alone." The suggestion clearly made him uncomfortable, and I could understand why. Our traditional financial arrangement, his salaries supporting the family, my contributions being domestic rather than monetary, had given him a certain amount of security and authority. The idea of his wife being his financial equal or potentially his financial superior challenged assumptions he'd probably never examined. "That's a big change," he said finally.
Everything about this is a big change. The question is whether we're going to adopt and grow together, or whether we're going to try to force our new reality into our old patterns. Over the days that followed, we began the careful work of negotiating a new dynamic. David started reading my blog regularly, sharing posts on his social media accounts, asking thoughtful questions about my business strategies. He attended a virtual conference with me, sitting quietly in the background while I participated in a panel discussion about building authentic online communities. Watching him watch me in that professional context was illuminating for both of us. He saw me as other people in my industry saw me, as an expert, a thought leader, someone whose insights were valuable enough that people paid to hear them. And I saw him seeing me that way, maybe for the first time in our marriage. "You're different when you're talking about your work," he said after the conference ended. "More confident, more yourself." This is myself. This has always been myself. You just hadn't seen this version of me because I didn't feel safe enough to show her to you.
The admission hurt both of us. Him because he'd never intended to create an environment where I felt unsafe being myself, and me because I had to acknowledge my own role in hiding parts of myself rather than fighting for them to be seen and valued. But slowly, carefully, we began to build something new on the foundation of what we'd learned about each other. David started introducing me differently at social events, highlighting my professional achievements rather than defaulting to stay-at-home mom. I started including him in business decisions where his expertise in marketing and finance could be valuable, treating him as a consultant rather than someone who needed to be protected from the complexities of my work. The book deal moved forward, with David accompanying me to meetings with publishers and agents, asking informed questions and offering insights that proved he'd been paying attention to everything I'd shared about my business. When the contract was finally signed, with an advance larger than his annual salary, he was the first person I called. "I'm proud of you," he said, and for the first time in 18 months, I believed him completely. But pride and understanding, we were both learning, weren't the same as comfort. The shift in our dynamic was real and permanent, and it required both of us to examine assumptions we'd carried about marriage, success, and identity. David had to reconcile his self-image as the primary breadwinner with the reality of his wife's superior earning power. I had to learn to accept recognition and support without waiting for the other shoe to drop, without preparing for the moment when his encouragement would turn back into condescension. "Do you ever miss it?" he asked one evening as we were cleaning up after dinner, a routine that now included him doing dishes while I answered emails from my business phone. I considered the question seriously. There had been something comfortable about our old dynamic, even if it ultimately felt limiting. The clarity of defined roles, the predictability of expectations, the safety of staying small enough that failure wouldn't be visible from a distance. "I miss feeling safe," I said honestly, "but I don't miss feeling invisible. And I think maybe the kind of safety that requires me to hide parts of myself isn't actually safety at all." He nodded, scrubbing a stubborn pan with more attention than it probably required. "I miss feeling like I knew what I was doing, like I understood my role in our family. Now everything feels uncertain." "Uncertain isn't the same as wrong," I said, wrapping my arms around him from behind as he stood at the sink. Maybe we needed some uncertainty. Maybe we'd gotten too comfortable with patterns that weren't actually working for either of us. The conversation ended there, but the questions it raised continued to shape how we moved forward. Because this wasn't just about my blog or his response to it. It was about two people who'd grown and changed within a marriage and were now trying to figure out whether they could love the people they'd become as much as they'd loved the people they used to be.
6 months later, I stood in the green room of a major television studio, adjusting the collar of a blazer that cost more than our monthly grocery budget, but felt like armor against the imposter syndrome that still occasionally crept in during moments like this. The morning show wanted to interview me about my book, which had debuted at number 3 on the New York Times bestseller list and showed no signs of slowing down. The irony wasn't lost on me that I was about to discuss finding your voice in a world that wants you silent on national television while my husband sat in the green room beside me, quietly reviewing his notes for his own interview segment. "You nervous?" David asked, reaching over to squeeze my hand with fingers that were steadier than mine. "Terrified," I admitted, and his laugh was warm and familiar in a way that reminded me why I'd fallen in love with him 15 years earlier. "You'll be brilliant," he said, with the kind of confidence that had once made me feel small, but now felt like genuine partnership. "You always are when you're talking about something you're passionate about." The transformation in our relationship hadn't happened overnight. Those first few months after the revelation had been messy and uncertain, full of conversations that lasted until dawn and uncomfortable silences that stretched across dinner tables. We'd gone to therapy not because our marriage was failing, but because we both recognized it was evolving into something neither of us had a roadmap for navigating.
Dr. Martinez had helped us understand that we weren't just dealing with hurt feelings or broken trust, we were renegotiating the fundamental power dynamics of our relationship. David had to learn to be proud of achievements that weren't his own while still maintaining his own sense of purpose and identity. I had to learn to accept support and admiration without constantly waiting for it to turn into something else, without preparing for the moment when my success would become too threatening to celebrate. The hardest part, Dr. Martinez had said during one particularly difficult session, is that you're both grieving the marriage you thought you had while trying to build the marriage you actually want. That's complex work, and it takes time. The morning show appearance was David's idea. When the producers reached out asking if I'd be willing to discuss not just the book, but the story behind it, the blog that had started as a creative outlet and evolved into a 7-figure business, I'd hesitated. The narrative of the dismissive husband and the secretly successful wife was compelling television, but it felt reductive in a way that made me uncomfortable. What if we both go? David had suggested. What if we tell the story together from both perspectives? What if we talk about what we've learned about supporting each other's dreams, even when they look different than what we expected? The idea was terrifying and perfect in equal measure, because the truth was, our story wasn't just about my success or his initial inability to see it. It was about two people learning to love each other's evolution, to celebrate growth, even when it changed the shape of their relationship. Sarah, a production assistant, appeared at the green room door, clipboard in hand, and the barely controlled energy of someone managing live television. "We're ready for you." I stood, smoothing my skirt and checking my appearance one last time in the mirror that reflected back a woman I was still getting used to seeing. Confidence, professional, successful in a way that didn't require anyone else's permission or validation. "Break a leg," David said, and I could see in his eyes the same pride I'd been searching for in his face for 18 months. The difference was that now I recognized it when I saw it, and I believed it was genuine.
The interview went better than I dared hope. The host, Jennifer Chen, had clearly done her homework, asking thoughtful questions about the blog's evolution, the business strategy behind building an authentic audience, and the challenges of balancing entrepreneurship with family life. But it was when she brought David out for the second segment that the conversation became something more than a standard book promotion. "David," Jennifer said, settling back in her chair with the practiced ease of someone who'd navigated thousands of these conversations, "you've had a unique perspective on Sarah's journey. What's it been like watching your wife build this incredible success?" I watched David carefully, still sometimes uncertain about how he would frame our story in public, but his answer was honest and thoughtful in a way that made my chest tighten with something that felt like falling in love all over again. "It's been humbling," he said, glancing at me with a smile that was self-deprecating but not self-pitying. For the first year and a half of Sarah's blog, I completely missed what she was building. I saw someone writing about motherhood and assumed it was just a creative outlet, rather than recognizing it as the foundation of a legitimate business. I had to confront my own assumptions about what success looks like and where it can come from. "That must have been difficult," Jennifer prompted. "It was," David acknowledged, "but it was also necessary. I realized I'd been so comfortable with being the successful one in our relationship that I wasn't actually seeing my wife clearly. I was seeing the role I needed her to play rather than the person she actually was. And she's extraordinary. The community she's built, the impact she's had on thousands of women's lives, the business acumen she's demonstrated. I'm incredibly proud of what she's accomplished, and I'm grateful that she gave me the chance to learn how to support her properly." The interview continued for another 10 minutes, but that moment, David's public acknowledgement not just of my success, but of his own growth, felt like the final piece clicking into place in a puzzle we'd been working on for months. Afterwards, as we sat in the car heading home, I reached over to take his hand. "Thank you," I said simply. "For what?" "For being willing to grow. For not just apologizing for the past, but actually changing how you show up in the present. For being proud of me in a way that doesn't diminish you."
He squeezed my fingers, navigating traffic with one hand while holding on to me with the other. I should have been doing that all along. Maybe. But the fact that you learned how to do it when it mattered, that means everything. The months that followed were a masterclass in building a partnership between equals who happen to love each other. We restructured our finances so that we each contributed proportionally to household expenses while maintaining our own financial independence. David started his own consulting practice, leveraging his corporate experience to help other companies with marketing strategy, and I watched with genuine excitement as he built something that was entirely his own. My business continued to grow in ways that sometimes still surprised me. The book's success led to speaking opportunities at major conferences, a podcast deal, and conversations about a potential television show. But more importantly, it led to messages from readers who'd used my organizational systems to start their own businesses, who'd left unfulfilling relationships after reading about the importance of honoring your own needs, who'd found the courage to pursue dreams they'd abandoned years earlier. "Look at this," I said one evening, showing David an email from a woman named Rebecca in Portland who'd started her own freelance graphic design business after reading my post about overcoming fear of failure. She's been supporting her family through freelance work for 6 months now. She says the blog gave her permission to believe her skills were valuable enough to monetize. "That's incredible," David said, and I could see that he genuinely understood what these messages meant to me. Not just validation of my work, but proof that the vulnerability I'd shared had created real change in real people's lives.
The ripple effects extended beyond my immediate audience. Emma, now 13 and acutely aware of everything happening around her, had started paying attention to the conversations David and I had about business, partnership, and supporting each other's dreams. I found her reading my blog posts sometimes, not with the casual interest of a daughter checking out her mom's work, but with the focused attention of someone trying to understand something important. "Mom," she said one afternoon as I was working in my office, "can I ask you something about the blog?" "Of course, sweetheart." "When you were my age, did you know you wanted to be a writer and a business owner?" The question was more complex than she probably realized. "I knew I loved writing," I said carefully, "but I didn't really understand that writing could be a business, or that my thoughts and experiences could be valuable enough for people to pay for them. I think I assumed that success in business required a certain type of personality or background that I didn't have. But you do have it." "I do now, but it took me a long time to believe that, and even longer to figure out how to build something around it." Emma was quiet for a moment, processing this information with the seriousness that teenagers bring to conversations about their potential futures. "I want to make sure I don't spend as much time as you did not believing in myself." The statement hit me like a physical blow, but in the best possible way. Because this was what it all had been for, really. Not just the money or the recognition or even the personal satisfaction of building something meaningful, but the example I was setting for my daughter about what was possible when you refuse to accept limitations other people placed on your potential. "You won't," I said, with certainty I felt in my bones. "Because you're growing up watching your mom build something from scratch, and watching your dad learn to celebrate success that isn't his own. You're learning that partnerships can evolve, that people can change, that dreams deferred don't have to become dreams abandoned." Jake, at 10, was less interested in the philosophical implications of my business success and more fascinated by the practical elements. He'd started creating his own blog using a kid-friendly platform, writing about video games and books with the kind of earnest enthusiasm that reminded me of my early posts. "Mom, how do you get people to read your blog?" he asked one Saturday morning, showing me his latest post about a new game he'd been playing. "You write about things you care about in a way that helps other people understand why they should care too. And you're consistent, and you're honest, and you treat your readers like they're smart enough to handle complex ideas. Can you teach me about the business stuff too, like how you make money from writing?" David, who was making pancakes at the stove, turned to grin at me. Looks like we might have another entrepreneur in the family. The world could use more people who understand that creativity and business skills aren't mutually exclusive, I said, ruffling Jake's hair as he scrolled through his analytics with the same intensity I'd once brought to checking my own stats. But the most significant change was in how David and I talked about the future. Our conversations now included both of our career aspirations, both of our financial goals, both of our dreams for what we wanted to build individually and together. We were planning a family vacation to Europe, funded entirely by my book advance. And David's excitement about the trip wasn't diminished by the fact that he wasn't paying for it. I used to think that if I wasn't the primary breadwinner, I wasn't fulfilling my role as a husband and father. He told me one night as we were walking through our neighborhood, holding hands like teenagers despite 15 years of marriage and 2 kids at home. I had this idea that providing financial security was the most important way I could show love for my family.
And now I think the most important way I can show love is by seeing you clearly, supporting your dreams even when they're bigger than mine, and raising kids who understand that success comes in many forms and that the people you love should be your biggest cheerleaders. The transformation wasn't complete. I suspected it never would be. We still had moments of friction when old patterns surfaced, times when David's instinct was to offer unsolicited advice about my business decisions, or when my inclination was to keep financial information to myself rather than share it openly. But we'd learned to recognize these moments as opportunities for growth rather than evidence of fundamental incompatibility. A year after that first confrontation in our living room, I was invited to keynote a conference for women entrepreneurs. The speech I gave, titled "The Permission You Don't Need to Ask For," was about the journey from seeking external validation to trusting your own expertise, from hiding your ambitions to owning your success. The most dangerous story we tell ourselves, I said to an audience of 500 women who were building businesses and chasing dreams and refusing to accept limitations, is that we need someone else's permission to become who we're meant to be. But the truth is, the only permission that matters is the permission you give yourself to stop making your dreams small enough that other people aren't threatened by them. David was in the audience that day, along with Emma and Jake, who'd insisted on coming to see Mama's big speech. When I looked out at them during the standing ovation that followed, I saw not just my family, but my partners in building a life that honored everyone's potential. The question and answer session after the speech was full of familiar themes: how to balance family responsibilities with entrepreneurial ambitions, how to handle unsupportive spouses, how to overcome the imposter syndrome that whispers you're not qualified for the success you're experiencing. "My husband keeps calling my business a hobby," one woman said, and the pain in her voice was so familiar it made my chest ache. He says he's supportive, but every conversation we have about it ends with him suggesting I be realistic about my expectations. How do you handle that kind of undermining? I looked at David before answering, seeing in his expression the recognition of his former self and the genuine regret for the pain he'd caused during those months of dismissal. Sometimes the people who love us are limited by their own assumptions about what's possible. Sometimes their concern about protecting us from disappointment actually becomes the barrier to our success. The question you have to answer is whether your husband is capable of growing past those limitations, or whether you need to find your support elsewhere while you build something he can eventually learn to appreciate. But how do you know the difference? You know because of how he responds when you stop asking for his permission and start building anyway. If he celebrates your success when it becomes undeniable, if he's willing to examine his own biases and change his behavior, if he can be proud of achievements that aren't his own, then you're dealing with someone who is limited by assumptions rather than threatened by your potential. The woman nodded, clearly processing the distinction, and I hoped she would find the courage to test which category her husband fell into. Later that evening, as we drove home from the conference, Emma asked the question that had been weighing on my mind for months. "Mom, do you think you and Dad would have gotten divorced if you hadn't been able to work things out?"
It was a fair question, and one I'd avoided thinking about too directly. The honest answer was complicated and uncertain in the way that hypothetical questions about alternate versions of your life always are.
I don't know, I said finally. I think we both had to decide whether we loved each other enough to do the hard work of growing together instead of growing apart. It would have been easier for Dad to insist I was being unreasonable, and it would have been easier for me to decide he was never going to change. But we both chose to believe that our marriage could evolve, and we both put in the work to make that evolution happen. I'm glad you did, she said simply, and I felt the weight of that gladness settle around my shoulders like a blessing. Because that was the real legacy of everything we'd been through. Not just the business success or the book deal or the financial independence, but the example we'd set for our children about what it looked like to love someone enough to let them become who they were meant to be, and to grow alongside them rather than trying to keep them small enough that they never outgrew your understanding of them. The money was life-changing, but the marriage we'd built on the other side of that first devastating conversation was something even more valuable. A partnership between two people who'd learned to see each other clearly and celebrate each other's evolution, even when it challenged everything they thought they knew about love and success and what it meant to build a life together. 3 years later, the notification sound that had once made my heart race with anxiety now brought nothing but quiet satisfaction. I glanced at my phone as I sat in my expanded home office, no longer the cramped storage room, but a bright, professionally designed space that David had surprised me with for our 16th wedding anniversary. The PayPal notification showed another 5-figure commission, but these days such amounts felt routine rather than miraculous. My second book, Building Bridges, How Couples Can Navigate Success Together, sat at number 1 on 3 different bestseller lists. The irony wasn't lost on me that a woman who'd once hidden her achievements from her husband was now helping other couples learn to celebrate each other's evolution. The book tour had taken me to 30 cities over the past 2 months, and David had joined me for half of them, not as my handler or manager, but as my partner, sharing our story with audiences hungry to understand how love could adapt to accommodate growth.
Sarah? The documentary director, Maria Santos, appeared in my office doorway with her characteristic blend of professional focus and genuine warmth. We're ready for the final interview segment if you are. I nodded, checking my appearance one last time in the small mirror David had hung next to my desk. Not because I was vain, but because I'd learned that representing success required looking the part, and I no longer apologized for caring about how I presented myself to the world. The living room had been transformed into a professional interview set, complete with lighting equipment and multiple cameras. David sat in his usual chair, looking comfortable in a way that would have been impossible 3 years earlier, when the idea of discussing our marriage on camera would have made him break out in a cold sweat. "Let's start with where you are now," Maria said, settling into her director's chair behind the main camera. "Sarah, your business is now generating over $2 million annually. David, your consulting firm is thriving. You've both written books. You're both successful in your own rights. How does that feel?" I looked at David, and he nodded for me to start. Not because he was deferring to me, but because we'd learned the rhythm of sharing conversations, of making space for each other's perspectives. "It feels like we're finally living authentically," I said. "For so many years, I was trying to be small enough that my ambitions wouldn't threaten the balance of our relationship. David was trying to be the sole provider in a way that didn't leave room for my financial contributions. We were both performing versions of ourselves that felt safe, but weren't actually true to who we were becoming." "David, how do you respond to critics who say you only became supportive of Sarah's success once it became too big to ignore?" It was a fair question, one that had been raised in some of the online commentary following my earlier interviews. David had developed a thoughtful response that managed to be honest about his failures without wallowing in self-criticism. "Those critics aren't wrong," he said simply. "I did dismiss Sarah's work until the financial success made it impossible to ignore. But I think that criticism misses the more important point, which is that people can change. I was raised with certain assumptions about gender roles and financial responsibility that I never examined until I was forced to. The question isn't whether I was initially supportive. I wasn't.
The question is whether I was capable of growth and whether Sarah was generous enough to give me the space to learn how to be the partner she deserved. And Sarah, was there ever a moment where you considered that the gap between who David was and who you needed him to be might be too wide to bridge? I thought carefully before answering, aware that my response would be preserved permanently and might influence how other women in similar situations approached their own relationships. There were many moments, I said honestly, but I think the turning point came when I realized I had to stop waiting for David's permission to be successful and start building my success regardless of his initial response. Once I shifted my focus from trying to make my dreams small enough that he wouldn't feel threatened to making my dreams as big as they naturally wanted to be, everything changed. David had to decide whether he wanted to be married to the woman I actually was or whether he wanted to keep trying to force me back into the box of who he thought I should be. And clearly, he chose to love who you actually were. He chose to learn who I actually was, I corrected. Love was never the question. We'd always loved each other. The question was whether our love was strong enough to accommodate growth, change, and a fundamental shift in our power dynamic. Maria turned her attention back to David. Speaking of power dynamics, how has your sense of masculine identity evolved through this process? There's still a cultural narrative that men should be the primary breadwinners. David leaned back in his chair, a gesture I recognize as him accessing his most thoughtful self. I had to separate my identity as a man from my identity as a provider. For most of my adult life, those two things were completely intertwined. I measured my worth as a husband and father by my ability to financially support my family. When Sarah started out-earning me significantly, it forced me to ask deeper questions about what I actually brought to our partnership beyond money. And what was the answer to that question? The answer was that I brought partnership itself. Emotional support, intellectual companionship, shared domestic responsibilities, co-parenting, friendship. But I also realized that I had been using financial provision as a shortcut to avoid doing some of the harder work of actually being present and engaged. It's easier to work late and write a check than it is to have difficult conversations or provide emotional labor.
I reached over to take his hand, a gesture that had become natural again after years of careful distance. One of the things I've learned is that David's growth through this process has made him a better partner in every way, not just in how he responds to my career success. He's more emotionally available, more engaged with the kids, more present in our day-to-day life. Let's talk about the kids, Maria said, adjusting her position to capture both of us in frame. Emma is now 16, Jake is 13. How has watching this transformation affected them? Emma is fierce, I said with obvious pride. She's starting her own business. She's applying for summer internships at tech companies. She's completely comfortable with the idea that she can be ambitious and successful and that the right partner will celebrate that rather than feel threatened by it. Jake is more interested in the creative side, David added. His YouTube channel has over 50,000 subscribers, and he's starting to get sponsorship offers. But more importantly, he's growing up understanding that success comes in many forms, and that supporting your family's dreams is just as important as pursuing your own. Do they understand the full scope of what you went through as a couple? David and I exchanged a look that spoke to the many conversations we'd had about how much of our marital struggles to share with our children. They understand that we had to learn how to support each other's growth, I said carefully. They understand that marriages require work and that people can change if they're committed to changing. They don't need to know every detail of our conflicts, but they do need to see the example of two people who chose to grow together rather than grow apart. Emma asked me once if I was threatened by Mom's success, David said, and I told her honestly that I was, initially, but that I learned being threatened by your partner's success is actually a sign that you need to work on yourself, not that your partner needs to be less successful. Maria nodded, making notes on her director's pad. Let's talk about the broader impact. Sarah, your blog now reaches millions of women monthly. Your books have sold over 500,000 copies. Your online courses have helped thousands of women start their own businesses.
Did you ever imagine this level of impact when you published that first post? Never, I said without hesitation. I thought maybe a few people would read my thoughts about the loneliness of motherhood and feel less alone. The idea that it would evolve into a platform for financial empowerment and business education, that it would help women leave unhappy marriages or start profitable businesses or negotiate better partnerships with their spouses, I could never have imagined that scope of influence. What do you think resonates so deeply with your audience? Authenticity, I said immediately. I share my real struggles, my actual numbers, my genuine failures along with my successes. I don't present myself as someone who has everything figured out. I present myself as someone who is figuring it out alongside my readers. When I write about imposter syndrome, it's because I'm experiencing imposter syndrome. When I share strategies for managing business anxiety, it's because those are strategies I'm actively using in my own life. And the message seems to be particularly powerful for women who feel trapped in traditional roles. The message is that no role has to be permanent, David interjected, surprising both Maria and I. Sarah's story isn't just about a woman becoming an entrepreneur. It's about two people learning that they could evolve within their marriage rather than being limited by it. That message applies to anyone who feels stuck in patterns that no longer serve them. Maria smiled. David, you've become quite the feminist ally through this process.
I've become a better husband, he corrected, which required examining a lot of assumptions I didn't even know I had about women's capabilities and ambitions. But Sarah did the hard work of building something extraordinary. I just learned how to get out of her way and then figure out how to support what she was creating. The interview continued for another hour, covering everything from our financial restructuring to our future plans to the advice we'd give other couples navigating similar transitions. When Maria finally called wrap, I felt the familiar exhaustion that came from excavating emotional material for public consumption, but also a sense of completion. Last question, Maria said as her crew began packing up equipment. Off the record, just for my own curiosity, do you ever wonder what would have happened if David hadn't been able to make the transition, if he'd remained threatened by your success? David and I looked at each other, and I saw in his expression that he'd wondered about this too. I think I would have been okay, I said slowly, which might be the most important thing I learned through this whole process. I discovered that I could build something meaningful and valuable independent of anyone else's validation or support. That knowledge changed everything, not because it made me less committed to our marriage, but because it made me committed for the right reasons. I would have lost the best thing in my life, David said quietly. Not just Sarah, but the chance to be married to someone who was living up to their full potential. I would have chosen safety and familiarity over growth and possibility, and I would have spent the rest of my life wondering what I'd given up. After the crew left, David and I walked through our house, straightening furniture and turning off lights, moving through the familiar choreography of two people who'd learned to share domestic space without keeping score of who contributed what. Do you think we'll watch it, the documentary, when it comes out? Probably, though it might be weird seeing our worst moments preserved for posterity. Our worst moments led to our best moments, I pointed out. Maybe that's worth preserving. In our bedroom, I sat at my vanity, removing makeup, while David changed into his pajamas, and the mundane intimacy of the moment struck me as profound. This was what we'd fought for, ultimately. Not the right to be successful, but the right to be ourselves within our marriage, to pursue our individual dreams while still choosing to build a life together. My phone buzzed with a text from Meredith. Just finished watching the rough cut Maria sent me. I'm crying. You two have come so far. I showed the message to David, who smiled as he read it. Your sister always believed we'd figure it out, even when I wasn't sure I believed it myself. She believed I'd figure out what I needed, and that you'd rise to meet it if you were the right person for me.
Turns out she was right on both counts. Later, as we lay in bed reading, David working through a business biography, while I reviewed the advance copy of a book written by one of my former blog readers who'd gone on to build her own seven-figure company, I felt the deep satisfaction of a day well lived, of a life well chosen. "Sarah," David said, closing his book and turning toward me, "I need to tell you something." The serious tone made me look up from my reading. "What's wrong?" "Nothing's wrong. I need you to know that watching you build what you've built, becoming who you've become, it's been the privilege of my life. I know I almost missed it. I know I almost let my own limitations keep me from seeing how extraordinary you are. But I'm grateful every day that you gave me the chance to grow into someone worthy of being your partner."
The words settled around my heart like a warm blanket, and I realized that this was what I'd been searching for all along. Not just success or recognition or financial independence, but the knowledge that I was seen and valued and celebrated by the person who mattered most. "We grew into people worthy of being each other's partners," I said, reaching over to turn off his bedside lamp. "That's what makes this work." As I drifted off to sleep in the house we'd paid off with my book advances, next to the man who now introduced me as my wife, the entrepreneur and best-selling author, I thought about the woman who'd started a blog in a storage room 3.5 years earlier. She'd been brave in ways she didn't even recognize, taking the first steps toward a future she couldn't have imagined. The money had been life-changing, but the marriage we'd built on the foundation of that initial crisis was the real treasure. A partnership between two people who'd learned that love meant celebrating each other's growth rather than limiting it, supporting each other's dreams rather than competing with them, and choosing to evolve together rather than insisting the other person stay small enough to fit inside familiar patterns. My last conscious thought before sleep was a message of gratitude to that woman who'd published her first vulnerable post about the loneliness of feeling invisible in her own life. She'd had no idea she was planting seeds for a forest that would eventually shelter thousands of other women seeking permission to become who they were meant to be. But perhaps the most beautiful part of the story was that she'd never needed anyone's permission at all. If Sarah's journey from hidden vlogger to celebrated entrepreneur inspired you, please hit that like button, share this story with someone who needs encouragement, and subscribe for more incredible tales of transformation. Your engagement helps us bring you these life-changing stories every week. What dreams are you keeping small that deserve to grow big?